Good morning, everyone. Anyone has any questions before we start?
Professor, I have a question. So, can you send the link for the last lecture recording?
As I said, you can go to YouTube and just put my name in, Nasser Douala, and you
Yes.
will see all the recordings on YouTube.
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, just put my name, Nasser Douala, on YouTube, and you will see all of these recordings come out. So,
Thank you.
so just go to whatever lecture you want to review, because all the lectures have titles on them, uh, and you can choose whatever lecture you want to listen to, because I guess YouTube is a lot more safer, because depending on the Zoom recording, it's not very accurate and not very clear. Sometimes I happen to get half of it recorded, other times none is recorded. Sometimes the link that I get from Zoom, it's the wrong link. So there's a lot of problems there. So I decided that, hey, instead of depending on that, let's do it on YouTube. It's a lot easier, faster, more efficient, and you'll be able to get the whole recording on YouTube. Okay. All right, today, let's see now. What we're going to do today is, first of all, we want to go over the effect of tariff on consumer welfare for a small country. And this problem I have already posted for you on Titanium. So you can go back and check it there. But today we want to go over it just to see how do we go about answering the questions that we have. We are given first of all, we're dealing with a small country here, and we're given the demand and supply curves for this small country that happens to be producing and importing calculators. The demand for this small country is given by the equation 36 minus 2p, and the supply also is given by the equation minus 12 plus 4p. Now, given the demand and supply, and also assuming that the world price for calculators happens to be $4, in other words, once this country decides to engage in trade, the world price for calculators would be $4. And if this country now decides to impose a $1 tariff on each calculator imported, how many calculators will Norway import under free trade? That's the first thing we want to know. And then, how many calculators will Norway import after the tariff is imposed? What is the deadweight loss for Norway as a result of the tariff? And what will be the change in consumer surplus after the tariff? So these are basically the questions we want to answer. Now, the first thing that we need to do, first step, is we want to be able to draw the demand and supply for calculators using these two equations. So we know that both of them are linear functions, which simply means they're going to be a straight line. So there's not going to be any curved demand or supply. Both will be linear. So in order to draw those linear demand and supply curves, all what we need to do is find 2 points on those lines. And the best way to do that with the demand, we're gonna take what happens to the quantity demanded? D, by the way, represents quantity demanded, and S represents quantity supplied. So now, if we take P equals 0, so this is one point on the demand curve where we take P equals 0, we will be able to determine exactly what the quantity demanded would be. So if P happens to be 0, what is quantity demanded?
36.
36, very good. And another point we want to take is when quantity demanded is equal to 0, what is P?
18.
18, very good. So now we can go to my demand curve and draw my demand curve at those 2 points. Meaning, if I come down to my demand, I see that when price is equal to 0, quantity demanded will be 36. So I'm going to have 1 point on the quantity axis right there, 36. And then when quantity is 0, I know price is going to be 18. So I'm going to have another point on the P axis that is equal to 18. So right there, I have those 2 points, 18 and 36. So just join those 2 points and voila, I got my demand curve. And I can do the same thing with supply. So for example, if I happen to take quantity supplied equals 0, what will my price be if the quantity supplied is equal to 0? Price would be equal to 3. So I'm going to have a point right here on the price axis. And since it's a straight line, I know this is a linear. So if I have 1 point right here, then all I can do is simply stretch that line forward, a straight line at point 3, and there I have my supply curve. Now, also what I need to do is find the autarky position for this small country. And this can be determined by setting demand equals supply and solving for P and Q. And if I do that, if I set demand equals supply, I will find that my price will be equal to 8 and the quantity bought and sold will be 20. So that's if I happen to put demand equals supply, I'm going to get an equilibrium price and I'm going to get an equilibrium quantity. And in this case, equilibrium price will be equal to 8. Equilibrium quantity will be equal to 20. So now that is done, now the next step is, I know what the world price is. What is the world price? Without tariff?
4.
4. Very good. So if I know what the world price is under free trade with no tariff, all I can do here is simply come to my price axis and locate where 4 is, and then draw a straight line. And that will give me the world price line or the world supply line. Now, at that point, I want to find out exactly how much I will be buying and how much I will be producing domestically. So what do I do? In order to find out how much I will be buying at this price, all I need to do is take this 4 and plug it into the demand and solve for quantity demanded. So if I take this 4 and plug it into the demand equation, D equals 36 minus 2P. So P is equal to 4. 4 times 2 is 8. So what is 36 minus 8?
20.
What's that?
28.
28, very good. So I have, this is exactly how much I will be buying when the price is equal to 4. Now I'm going to see, well, what happens to domestic production when the price is 4? So what do? I take P equals 4 and plug it into the supply equation. So if I do that, what do I get? 4 times 4 is 16. 16 minus 12?
4.
4. Very good. So I have my 4 right there. So now, at the price of 4, I know we will be buying 28 calculators. And out of those 28, we will only produce 4 calculators at home. So how much will we be importing?
24.
24, very good, which is 28 minus 4. So this will be the imports. Let's see if we have the answer right there. I don't know if, yeah. 28 minus 4 is 24 calculators. Now, what happens when we impose a $1 tariff? What will change here? Anyone?
World price.
Very good. So what am I going to do with the world price here?
You're going to have to move it up equal to the amount of the tariff.
Which is?
1, you said. So you would move that
Right.
up to 5 on our world supply line.
Very good. So now I have a new supply curve with the tariff, and I'm going to call it WP plus T. So it's going to be a straight line. And again, the reason why it's a straight line, because I'm dealing with a small country. And now I'm going to repeat exactly the same process again. I'm going to say, okay, when the price is $5, how much are we going to be buying? So I'm going to plug that 5 into the demand curve. And if I do that, this would tell me exactly how many calculators I will be buying. So if you plug 5 into the demand, what will be the quantity demanded?
26.
26, very good. And when the price is 5, how much are we going to be producing at home? Again, I'm going to plug that 5 into the supply equation, and that will give me 8. Very good. 8. 8 will be produced at home, but we will be buying 26. So how much are we going to be importing?
18.
18, very good. So let's see if we got the right answer or not. Let's check. Very good, 18, that's what it is. Norway will import 26 minus 8, which is equal to 18 calculators. Now, what was the other question that we asked? Well, let's check here. I don't remember the questions, but we'll go. Okay, so we answered 1 and 2. Now we're going to answer 3. What is the dead weight loss to Norway? From this graph, can you tell me what the dead weight loss is?
The area of triangle 1 plus the area of triangle 2.
Very good. Were you able to calculate those areas?
Yeah, just a moment.
Half base times
4.
height. What's that?
It's equal 4.
For both of them?
Yes.
Okay, let's check and see if we got the right answer or not.
26 and 28.
No.
Can you come back to the graph? Let me check again.
Yeah. Let's go back to the graph and check the areas of those two little triangles. So the first triangle 1 is half base times height. Now what is the base?
Base is 4.
4. And what is the height?
1.
And so what will be the area there?
That's going to be 2.
Very good. 2. So we got 2 right there. Let's come to triangle 2. What is
The
what's
difference is the
area?
base there. The base is 2 there. That's where the difference is.
2 and times 1 is 2, and half of that is 1. Correct?
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
It's not about the deadweight loss, but it's for area 3. And like to solve area 3, you need to combine 3 and 1, and then to basically solve with the area of the rectangle, and then subtract it from area 1, which is the triangle.
Correct.
Okay,
Yep.
cool.
That's what you.
Thank you.
No problem. Now, let's see here. So we were already able to determine area 1 and area 2. Area 1 is simply half base times height, which is half times 4, which is 2. And then the other one is half base times height, which is half times 2 times 1. Half of 2 is 1, so 2 plus 1 should be 3. Yep. So the answer is 3. Now someone said it's 4. How did you get 4?
If I had to guess, they probably thought the base was equal on area 2, triangle 2.
Very good. So now everyone is clear about the deadweight loss here and how we found it. Any questions on that? Everyone agrees that the deadweight loss is $3?
Think we agree.
Okay, good. Now let's go to the change in consumer surplus. Now, what is the change in consumer surplus? Let's see here. Can someone tell me what's the change in consumer surplus as a result of the tariff?
It's the areas of 1, 2, 3, and 4.
Very good. It's areas 3 plus 1 plus 4 plus 2. All of that is change in consumer surplus. In other words, once we impose a tariff, the consumer will lose part of its surplus. And the way to measure the loss consumer surplus will be to measure areas 3, 1, 4, and 2. Now 4, by the way, very important, is this whole area right here. This is 4. Okay? Make sure you, even though, you know, the way I should have probably put 4 a little bit to the right just to make sure that, you know, that it's, but that's what I mean by that area 4. It's that whole rectangle. So how do we go about finding it? Did anyone find it already?
12?
12?
Yes.
27.
26.
26?
27.
27? Wow, we got so many different answers here, right?
27.
27. Anyone else with 27?
I got 27 too.
27, very good. So I guess, yeah, those of you who said 27 probably are right. How did we do that? Well, first of all, what is the area 3 plus 1 plus 4? It's this whole rectangle, right?
Yes.
Okay, which is, what is the base of that rectangle?
26.
26. And what is the height?
1.
1. So the area will be 26 times 1, which is 26. So now all I have left is area 2. Yes, someone has a question.
No, that's where I got my 26 from. I forgot little 2 on the end there.
Okay, all right. So now that whole area, 3 plus 1 plus 4 is 26. We all agree, correct?
Yes.
Now all what we have left is area 2. So I need to find the area of the triangle 2, which is half base times height. Now what is the base? The base is 2. What is the height? The height is 1. So 2 times 1 is 2. Half of that is 1. So now the change in consumer surplus will be equal to 26 plus 1, which is equal to $27. Let's see if the answer is correct. Let's check the answer. Yeah. By the way, I think in the notes that were posted on Titanium, probably there was, and I think yes, there was a misprint here. It should be 27. And I think it was shown as 26 or 24. I don't remember now, but there was a misprint. So just make sure that you go with these. So just copy these things down. Make sure that you have them in your notes, and make sure you make the necessary changes on the posted notes on Titanium. So it's area 1 plus 3 plus 4, which is equal to $26. Area 2, which is equal to $1. Therefore, the change in consumer surplus is 26 plus 1 equals 27. So I'm going to leave it right there for a few minutes just to make sure that you take them down because you're going to be wanting to make the changes in the notes that were posted on Titanium right here. I think you're going to make changes right there. Okay, any questions so far on this problem? And this, by the way, is very similar to the homework questions, right?
Yes.
Anyone has any questions regarding the homework? Any difficulties or any misconceptions or?
Professor, in the beginning of this example, could you go to the top of this example?
Okay. Where do you want me to start?
I was curious about the equation.
Oh, okay, the equation, very good. Let's go to the equations. Here are my equations. Demand equals 36 minus 2p.
Is that a standard? In other words, are those numbers don't change? The
Oh, they
36,
do.
or is it for this example?
Oh, for this example, no.
Okay, just want to
Yeah.
be certain.
Yeah, for this example, the demand is demand. Supply is supply, basically. This is what that small country faces in as far as its demand for calculators and supply of calculators. It doesn't change. Demand and supply stay the same. What changes is the world price. What changes is the tariff. Maybe, instead of imposing a $1 tariff, maybe we impose $2 or half a dollar. I don't know. The world price may be, I don't know, $3. Or the world price may be $5. Or the world price may be $2. Those things could change. In other words, the small country has no power over those things. The government has the power over the tariff. The government would determine what the tariff would be. And the world supply of calculators and world demand for calculators will determine what the world price of calculators would be. So those things can change. But the demand and supply for that particular country will not change. Okay, any other questions? Okay, so then let's move forward. And yeah, that's good. I thought that it was not recording. Good job, it was recording. Sometimes, you know, I happen to put a pause on recording and I forget to resume it, but fortunately, the recording is on, has been on. Okay, no more questions on this or the homework. So can we leave this for good for now? All right. Then let's go to,
Professor, actually, I have a question on the homework. So
yeah.
I go back and then check on the supply equation. And I saw that it have a positive equation. So is it usually the supply equation is usually with a negative number, right?
Yeah, it depends, you know, it depends on the way it is drawn, basically. In other words, it depends on the numbers for what you have. But in this case, of course, if this was positive, let's say if we had a positive plus 12 instead of a negative.
Mhm.
Now, if the quantity supplied was equal to 0, what will the price be? Price is going to be -3, correct?
Yes.
And we don't want negative prices, basically. So that's the reason why that happened to be a negative intercept right there.
Mhm.
Okay, so it just depends on the way the numbers are given on that particular equation. You know, if the numbers were such that if I come up with a positive price, then, you know, I might not need to have that negative intercept there.
Thank you, Professor.
Okay, all right. Now let's see the what we're going to be dealing with today in as far as chapter 7 is concerned. And this chapter, by the way, very interesting chapter. And as you can see, this chapter deals with trade policies for developing nations. Well, the good thing for some of you who don't like to calculate numbers or deal with equations or draw graphs or anything of that nature, you know, this chapter really has nothing to do with all of that. This chapter, I guess, is the simplest chapter of all the chapters that we will be dealing with in international economics. And that's why it's pretty much interesting, because it tells us basically the difference between poor developing nations and rich developed nations. How do we know which countries are poor and which countries are rich? How do we know which countries are developed and which countries are developing? That's number one. Number two, we want to find out, what do the poor countries concentrate on producing and exporting? And what do rich countries concentrate on producing and exporting? And also, we want to find out if there is any conflict between developed and less developed countries when it comes to trade. And we see that there are a lot of conflicts. There's a lot of tension between less developed and developed countries when it comes to trading. Why? We will explore some of the reasons for the tension or the conflict. Obviously, we will not be going very deep into it. In other words, we really are not going to be talking about the WTO, the World Trade Organization, in any sort of details. And again, the reason obviously is because of the constraint of time. We really don't have enough time to go over everything, basically. So we have to pick and choose. But, we will look at some of the conflicts or tension that has arisen as a result of trade taking place between these two blocks of nations. We will also look at some of the concerns of the less developed countries when it comes to trade. Why are they concerned? And then we want to see if trade has played a positive role in as far as economic growth and development for the less developed countries, or to the contrary, trade has actually been a hindrance. So we really want to look at those arguments. And then we also want to look at the different strategies, development strategies, economic growth strategies undertaken by the less developed countries. We will basically focus on two strategies. One is called the ISI, Import Substitution Industrialization strategy, and the other one is called Export-Led Growth strategy. So we will look at those two particular strategies, and we will see their weaknesses and how successful countries have been in implementing those strategies. And we also look at the OPEC oil cartel. What was the influence of the OPEC oil cartel on the growth for oil-producing countries, and also for disrupting trade as a result of this huge price increases in oil. So we will pretty much learn a few lessons from that. And we will also look at how China has been able to advance and progress economically. How did China do it? In other words, by the way, China really doesn't have that many resources. It's basically like Japan. Japan doesn't have that much resources. But look at where Japan went after the Second World War. They made huge strides in industrialization and development, and in making that country one of the richest countries in the world in terms of per capita income. How did they do it? The same way China. How did China do it? Well, China has very, very few resources. The only resource that they have is basically labor. But look what they have done with labor, basically. And look at the successes of the Chinese government, whether you agree with the political system of China or you don't. That's really not our goal here, is to say, well, China is really not a democracy, China is a dictatorship, China does a lot of bad things. We're not concerned with that. At this point in time, we're simply concerned with economic growth and development. In other words, we want to investigate whether China was successful in reducing poverty, whether China was successful in increasing per capita income, and whether China was successful in making its economy basically one of the largest, or to be exact, the second largest in the world. So, that takes a lot of work. And, we have to agree that China was able to be extremely successful. Now, why has China been successful where other countries have not? Why was China able to develop in just a few decades, basically maybe 20 years? It took China to actually jump from being one of the poorest nations in the world to one of the strongest, economically speaking, nations in the world. Why? What happened? What did China do? What's the magic? So there are a lot of things that other less developed countries can learn from China. In other words, they don't need to replicate the Chinese economic model 100%. You can never do that, but at least you can pick and choose. What are the things that China did which you can actually adapt to your own economy? And I think, there are a lot of things that China did which a lot of poor countries, less developed countries can learn from. In other words, you really don't need to reinvent the wheel. China has already invented the wheel for you. So why not learn from the Chinese experience, the Chinese experiment? Now, some countries have done that and they did pretty well for themselves, especially India. And of course, a lot of the other countries in Latin America did take some of the experiences from China, even though, the whole thing is completely different. China from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America. As I said, you can't replicate the model 100%, but you can always find certain things that may actually can work for you. And China has done it the smart way. Very, very quiet. You see the Chinese extremely quiet diplomatically. They really don't make a fuss. And they know exactly what they're doing. They have an extremely sound plan of being able to get what they want. Not through ultimatums or through threats or through wars or military force. China doesn't do any of that because they don't have to. They do it basically economically. In fact, if you look at the continent of Africa today, it's pretty much controlled by China. How? Not militarily, just economically. China invests in the infrastructure. It invests in education. It invests in agriculture. It invests in all of these things. And that's the reason why you find these countries are pretty much in agreement with China, basically. You don't see countries wanting to fight China. You don't see countries hating China. And the reason, again, is because China is doing it the right way. So China is doing something that is working. So the Chinese model, in as far as global economics, is just doing a good job. It's working. And, you really have to give them their dues for being able to do that. And as I said, here we're not trying to lay judgments on the Chinese government. This is something that the Chinese people have to do themselves. And you really can't intervene in domestic politics. The Chinese have to take care of that themselves. If they feel that the government is good, well, fine, they'll support it. If they feel the government is not good, then obviously they need to do something to change it. But it's not up to the rest of the world to intervene in China's affairs in as far as politics is concerned. And this is a huge lesson that other countries can learn from the Chinese experiment, where China does not get involved in other people's politics. And this is one way I think that the Chinese were able to move forward in as far as their economy is concerned. They were pretty much successful in alleviating a lot of the poverties. In other words, the poverty reduction in China has been tremendous, remarkable. So we will talk about that. That's why I said this chapter is very interesting, because it really gives us different views on exactly what countries are doing, how they are approaching their economic growth and development, were they successful? If so, where did they succeed? And if not, where did they fail? So, you know, it gives us a good general picture of what's going on around us. And that's why, you know, I find it to be very, very interesting. And it's a good read, by the way. You know, I really do recommend that you read this chapter and form your own opinions and your own ideas. And as I said, always, there is no such thing as completely correct or completely wrong. It just doesn't exist. You know, there's always some things that you find weaknesses in, you find strengths in. Some things may be to your liking, other things may not. So you just have to be objective. You have to look at the thing from outside, basically, and form your opinions based on your analysis, on your readings, and also on what's going on around you, basically. So there is no such thing as completely right or completely wrong. It just doesn't exist in the real world. And no one can say, I hold the truth, because nobody does. You know, you gotta start from that premise, basically, and build on from there on whatever you see, whatever you detect, whatever you can analyze by looking at data, by, you know, just have or formulate a more comprehensive view of what the world is around you. And I guess that's the best approach to use. But don't try to be too extreme in your views, and don't try to hold, you know, one view and stick to it and say, well, this is, you know, the truth, or everything is so good and dandy about this, and everything is so bad and ridiculous about the other. No, it doesn't work that way. You know, every country has something to offer. Every country has weaknesses and strengths. And this is really, at least, this is how I look at things. I am not an extremist in any way. I don't happen to hold views either to the right or left. You know, all of that really means nothing to me. What's important is being objective and, you know, looking at all views and accepting them for what they are. Now, as I said, some maybe extremist views, but you know, that's fine. Everyone is entitled to their views, of course. But you know, just don't be judgmental. This is all what I'm trying to say. Always try to look at everything from all sides, from all angles, and try to be rational when analyzing things, and try to understand, you know, what's going on around you, basically. And if you do that, then, you know, there is no way you're going to go wrong if you take that approach. And I think that's the best approach that someone can take, is to be right in the middle, to be able to look at everything and not to be judgmental, basically. Okay, so hopefully, you know, we'll be able to learn a lot from this chapter. Any questions so far of where we're going or where we're heading with this chapter? Okay, the first thing that we want to do here is we want to be able to come up with a definition of developed versus developing nations. And obviously, according to the UNPD, United Nations Program for Development, they happen to define developed rich countries and developing poor countries in terms of three criterias or indicators. Indicator number one is per capita income. So those countries with high per capita income happen to be considered rich, advanced, developed. Those with low per capita income happen to be developing, poor countries. So that's indicator number one, per capita income, meaning how much each individual is making in terms of income per year. How much are they getting per year, each individual? So what you are doing here is you're simply taking total income and dividing it by the population. And when you do that, you get per capita income. Indicator number two has to do with education. The more educated the people of a particular country are, the more advanced, the more rich, the more developed they will be. So how are we going to measure the level of education? Well, the level of education is simply measured in terms of adult literacy and also, which we will not go into here, but if you're taking a course in economic development, you are obviously going to be doing this, in other words, looking at it more deeply. But for our purposes in this chapter, we will simply look at the simplistic approach and we will not get too deep into measurements or really, taking it to the next level, if you will. So, we would be satisfied by just looking at adult literacy rate, basically, rather than looking at the number of years in school, etc. There are so many other ways to determine the level of education in a particular country, but for our purposes, we simply look at adult literacy. So that's
Professor.
yeah.
I'm sorry. Did you mention anything about like graduation rates or like
No.
college graduation rates? Okay.
No. We're simply looking at adult literacy, basically.
Understood.
How many people can read and write? This is as I said, if you really want to go deep into this, you probably take it in economic development course, and you will really go into this graduation rates, college, etc. It makes more sense, of course, to be taking that route. But for our purposes, we're just going to take the simplistic approach here. And, by simply looking at adult literacy rate, would be sufficient for us. And then, of course, we have health conditions. We've got to be able to measure health conditions as well. And this is usually measured in terms of what we call LEB, L-E-B. Life expectancy at birth. LEB, L-E-B. Life expectancy at birth. And, by looking at those things, those three things, per capita income, educational levels, health conditions, we will be able to get an idea of where each country stands. And usually the UN puts a term regarding the three indicators, combines them into one, and calls it the Human Development Index. So there is a number for each country. Each country has a Human Development Index number. So obviously the higher Human Development Index a country has, the more advanced, the more developed, the more rich a country is considered to be. The lower the Human Development Index is, the poorer, the less advanced, the less developed a country is. So everything rests on Human Development Index, and this is according to the UN. That's what the UN uses to determine whether countries are advanced, rich, or less developed and poor, by simply looking at the HDI, Human Development Index. Okay, so we were not going to be spending too much time on that, but at least now you have an idea of how the UN pretty much categorizes different countries in different categories in terms of development versus less development. Just looking at those three, or in a nutshell, the HDI, the Human Development Index. So everyone knows what the Human Development is?
Yes, thank you.
Very good. All right, so let's move forward here. Again, I guess, you know, the author is saying exactly what I've been saying. Advanced nations happen to have high levels of gross domestic product per capita, longer life expectations, higher levels of adult literacy. Developing nations, on the other hand, happen to have low levels of GDP per capita, shorter life expectancies, and also lower levels of adult literacy. So those are basically the things that we just mentioned. And here, of course, the author also gives you some data picked from the World Bank, and the World Bank is a good source, by the way, for finding data on less developed versus advanced countries. So it's a good source to keep in mind whenever you are interested in finding economic data for less developed countries. Just go to the World Bank or the IMF. Those two institutions compile a lot of data, and it's not an easy thing to do, by the way. It's very, very expensive, time consuming, and it puts a huge responsibility on these institutions. So you may always want to use them as your source of data. And here, of course, you know, the author picks a few countries here. Switzerland with a per capita income of 57,000 per person, which is pretty high, pretty good. And this is, by the way, in 2013. So now we're in 2020. For sure, those numbers have changed tremendously. You look at the US, $53,000 per person. That's also pretty good. Japan, 36,000. Now, where is the cutoff point? That's the problem. You know, in other words, it's very, very difficult to determine where the cutoff point is. In other words, where do we stop? Do we stop at 30,000? Do we stop at 35? And we say that this is the cutoff point. This is really what distinguishes a rich country from a poor country? I don't know. I don't know where the cutoff point is, because really this doesn't tell me anything.
Even when you put it next to adult literacy, right?
Yeah, still. Because you're
Because
going
they're kind of like
to
apples and oranges, and you're trying to make kind of a generalization with just those two
Right.
pieces of information.
Exactly. Even with Human Development Index, where is the cutoff point? You know, I know the Human Development Index is going to go from 0 to 100.
Yeah, because if you look at Algeria and Indonesia, for example, while there may be a difference in their GDP, the adult literacy rate is, you know, very drastically different.
Very good. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's why, you know, we need to go and look at the Human Development Index, which really gives you a weighted measure of these things. In other words, especially the new Human Development Index. There's a difference between the Human Development Index and the new Human Development Index. They're simply computed differently, and I really don't want to go into this because it really gets too involved. Now, the new Human Development Index is, you know, the way it's measured, it's measured based on raising a lot of these variables to the powers of their weight. In other words, let's say if in the Human Development Index, let's say per capita income happens to be weighted 1/3. In other words, if they are all given equal weights, 1/3, 1/3, and 1/3, then these things will be raised to the power 1/3. However, with the old Human Development Index, you are really not raising them to the power of 1/3, but you are multiplying them by 1/3. So it makes a huge difference there. And I don't want to get into the techniques or the mechanics of it all, but you know, these are some of the things that economists basically look at. And you know, if I were to look at these things, the first thing I want to do is I want to see how this Human Development Indexes are being computed, and you know, the different weights given and why. You know, you may give per capita income 1/3 weight and the others, you know, probably a little bit less weight or more or similar. All of these things make a huge difference. So that's why, you know, the Human Development Index is just a rough measure, basically. It's like GDP, for example. It's a rough measure of the economic potential of a country. How are you going to measure it? Well, the best thing we have is GDP. So, you know, we use GDP to measure the economic potential. I mean, what else do we have? I mean, very little. So, you know, we're pretty much heavily reliant on GDP, even though it has a lot of limitations. The same thing with the HDI. It has a lot of limitations, but what's the alternative?
Professor?
So far, not much. Yes.
Would there be any value in looking at ratios in order to kind of like get everything on the same playing field? In other words,
Yeah.
you've got a large company like Switzerland, and then you've got something like Indonesia, but those, just because those are larger numbers, they may not be indicative of like development or wealth or what have you. In other words, if there's a ratio like based on like, I don't know, population and then GDP or something along those lines, is there any value in that?
That's what we're doing basically when we look at per capita GDP, we're dividing by population. So we're really not looking at the absolute income level, but we're looking at per capita income. So we're dividing by population there. And that's one of the reasons why China gets hit real hard.
Because they have so many people.
Exactly. That's why when you look at Human Development Index for China, it's pretty low. And the reason why it's low, it's not because China is not doing very well economically in terms of economic growth, etc., and economic potential, but rather because of high population, basically. And that's why China is still ranked in the developing nations and not developed nations. simply because of the population size, basically. That's all it is. So the per capita income for China is very low compared to other advanced countries. So China will never have the opportunity to enter the club of the highly advanced, rich countries, basically.
Again, showing the challenge and how we're measuring these things.
Right, absolutely. A lot of limitations, a lot of weaknesses. And I guess, you know, the UN really has to come up with, I mean, they have so many economists working for them, advisors. So, you know, they need to put their heads together and find something out that would be closer to actually coming up with a more accurate way to measure the HEI and everything else. But anyway, this is not something that we want to go over here in class. But obviously, at least now you have a good idea of the challenges faced. Okay, so let's go to the less developed countries now, and let's see, for example, what type of goods the less developed countries happen to be producing, and what goods do they export, and what goods do they import. This is very, very important. We got to know that. And also another thing that is very important is the trade structure, the global trade structure. So if you look at the trade that takes place between rich countries, the volume of trade is huge between rich countries, advanced countries. Now, if you look at the volume of trade between developing countries or poor countries, the volume of trade is relatively low. Now, if you look at the volume of trade between rich and poor, it's very high. So the structure here is very, very important, the way the trade is structured between the different countries. In other words, the global trade structure is extremely important. And you can see from here that less developed countries are highly dependent on advanced nations. Most of their imports originate in advanced nations. In other words, they pretty much import almost everything from advanced nations. In other words, less developed countries produce very, very little. And as a result, they're pretty much dependent on advanced countries for a lot of the goods that they consume. And this is one of the weaknesses of less developed countries. You gotta diversify. You gotta start producing a lot of things for yourself, even though from an economic point of view, it may not be wise. It may not be economically efficient, as we have studied, but then again, it's going to put you at a disadvantage. Because remember, what did we say about competitive advantage? Does anyone remember what we said? And we pretty much emphasized that. Didn't we say that competitive advantage is dynamic? Does everyone remember when we talked about dynamic competitive advantage? And what did we mean by that? When we said dynamic, when we say competitive advantage is dynamic, what did we mean by that?
It can change. It can evolve.
Very good, excellent. So in other words, less developed countries can actually find a niche in producing a lot of the goods and making sure that they will end up with a competitive advantage in producing it. So in other words, competitive advantage is not something static. In other words, poor countries cannot lay back and say, well, there's really nothing we can do because we don't have a competitive advantage in anything, so we will simply continue to import. No, that's the wrong strategy. The good strategy is what Japan did in post-World War II. What did Japan do? Anyone? You remember when we talked about dynamic comparative advantage in Japan? What did we say? Did Japan have a competitive advantage in steel? No. But Japan ended up having a competitive advantage in steel. So in fact, they created a competitive advantage in steel. They didn't have it, but they were able to create it. And from there, they were able to take off. So the less developed countries have to learn how to create competitive advantage. Now, China did that. China, in fact, doesn't have a competitive advantage in a lot of the goods that it is producing, but it ended up having one. Why? Because they sought that competitive advantage. They worked so hard to get competitive advantage in goods that they were not supposed to have a competitive advantage in, especially in capital-intensive goods. But they created it. So again, I don't want you to think that competitive advantage is static. It's not. It's dynamic. And this is one of the mistakes of a lot of the poor developing countries. They simply took the concept of competitive advantage as being static and not dynamic. And they pretty much laid back and said, well, you know what? We're going to continue producing agricultural goods or primary products because we have a competitive advantage in it, and we will try to export it overseas. But obviously this strategy doesn't work. And less developed countries found that out the hard way. And the reason, again, is now why do we have this tension between the poor and the rich countries? And obviously, a lot of these tensions remain unresolved through the WTO. The WTO can do very little to resolve a lot of these tensions. And, I don't want to go into the WTO and why it's not able to, because, that will take a long time to go over it. I mean, there's so much material and literature on the WTO that we really have to familiarize ourselves with in order to be able to see how the WTO actually works and who makes the decisions in the WTO ultimately. Again, will take us into politics, and I really don't want to go and take that route for now. But the main tension between the rich and the poor is that the rich are right now refusing to lower tariffs on labor-intensive manufactured goods produced by less developed countries. The rich are telling the poor countries, we will not reduce tariffs on manufactured goods, but we will reduce all tariffs on primary products. So you can sell us as much primary products, raw materials, fuels, agricultural goods as you can. And we're not going to put any tariff on that, except a few. But on the whole, you're free to sell us all those. But when it comes to manufactured goods, no, we're really going to put tariffs. And this is what's making poor countries angry. In other words, they're telling the rich countries that you don't want us to compete with you on manufactured goods. That's the reason why you're placing those huge tariffs, because you want us to continue to produce and specialize in producing agricultural goods.
It doesn't allow developing nations to change, to become powerful. They'll have to always use labor intensive things or low tech, like this is like simple manufactured goods in that way.
Right, absolutely. And this is one of the tensions between the poor and the rich. And unfortunately, the WTO was not able to resolve these issues. They're still ongoing. So, you know, those are simply some of the problems. Now, that's not to say that, you know, the less developed countries don't have problems of their own. And they actually need to put their house in order. In other words, it's a lot easier blaming, you know, the rich and advanced countries for all your woes and problems. But, you know, common sense tells us that no, I mean, you know, the less developed countries also have problems of their own that they need to attend to and make sure that they can actually solve those issues. And they have plenty of problems, as we will see in just a minute. So developing nations, of course, not all, but on the most part, have actually been able to make strides in terms of development, meaning they were able to invest more in human capital and technology. They were able to attain higher educational levels, also attain higher capital stock per worker. All of these things are good for the less developed countries. And, you know, I would say probably 50% of the less developed countries were able to take those strides. The other 50% obviously fell behind and were not able to do much. And also improvements in transportation and communications made it a lot easier for these countries to actually be able to export a lot of the goods that they were not able to export beforehand. Because transportation costs, in other words, once they're reduced, they can actually act as a competitive advantage to you. They will add to your competitive advantage, like we saw from the transportation cost problems. If you're able to lower transportation costs, this will help trade between countries. And for countries that did not have a competitive advantage because of high transportation costs, now with lower transportation costs, those countries can actually regain some of their competitive advantage. So transportation and communications are extremely important in as far as trade is concerned. And obviously, technological improvements has made it such that transportation costs have become a lot cheaper, and communications obviously has become more sophisticated, and it has made huge strides in terms of trade between countries. Also, some countries in the less developed world were able to make some trade reforms, and they were very successful in doing that. And some countries were also able to liberalize their trade. In other words, reduce trade barriers. So all of these things helped some countries, but not all. And the reason is simply because not all countries were on the same page. Some less developed countries were able to take those steps and take advantage and exploit them. And other countries simply were in the dark. They had no idea where to go, how to go about doing this. And so, you know, it's one of those things. Poor nations, again, they need to take advantage of international trade. But what is the problem here? The problem, according to the poor nations, is advanced world, the rich countries. Why? Because the rich countries have increased barriers to imports from developing nations. However, as I said before, this is not the only problem. It's just one of the problems. There are other problems. What are these other problems? They have to do with the structure of these economies within the less developed countries. Very weak, inept, structural, economic weaknesses. The non-existent or inadequate institutions and policies. Political system also in these countries is inept. You don't have good, strong institutions in terms of law and order, property rights. If you don't have property rights, you can never attract foreign direct investment. These countries lack sustainable macroeconomic management. They lack public services. Public services, in terms of education, health, etc., are only accessible to very, very few. Not all people in less developed countries have full access to public services. And this is a huge problem. And they have to address all these problems, all these issues. Okay, we're going to leave it right there because we are running out of time, but any questions so far? Okay, I guess not. Okay, so we will leave it right there, and hopefully I will see you Thursday.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor.
You're welcome.
Professor, I have a question.
Yes.
So on Thursday, we'll continue with chapter 7 and we'll have review for the exam, right?
No. On Thursday, we will not touch chapter 7. We will
Okay.
only look at the midterm exam review. That's all.
So the midterm is only for chapter 1 to 4?
Correct.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good day.
Take care now. Any other questions before I leave? Okay, I guess not. Okay, take care, all of you, and I'll see you Thursday.